It is widely expected that one of America's next national parks, perhaps the next one, will be centered along the Ocmulgee River corridor near Macon, Georgia. In this video, I'm going to give you a deep dive on the efforts to create this national park. I'm going to give you everything you need to know to understand what an Ocmulgee National Park may look like if established, why this park is even being proposed, and why the National Park Service itself thinks it's not such a good idea. Alright, before I started filming this, I put out a call to you guys asking if you had any questions about this park effort. You came through in a big way, so thank you for being engaged and being curious. I'm going to do my best to answer your questions, so here we go. So, right out of the gate, I just want to clarify the extent of what's actually being proposed when we talk about a potential Ocmulgee National Park. This is probably the biggest piece of confusion I've seen when this park has come up on the news and has been talked about online. Often, when this park is talked about, people seem to think that the existing Ocmulgee Mounds National Historical Park, which currently protects around 3,700 acres, would simply be redesignated as a national park. In other words, nothing changes about the park except its name. Same boundaries, same resources, just a name change. That's not actually the case. The proposal for an Ocmulgee National Park is aiming to incorporate several other pieces of surrounding public and private land, including the Bond Swamp National Wildlife Refuge and 3 State of Georgia Wildlife Management areas, consolidate those with Ocmulgee Mounds National Historical Park, and create a larger national park along the Ocmulgee River corridor in Middle Georgia. There are several permutations of this depending on which land is actually incorporated, but at its largest, the proposed Ocmulgee National Park could be up to 80,000 acres. So again, we're not talking about a simple redesignation here. Also, it's important to note that the effort to create a national park along the Ocmulgee River is being proposed as a national park and preserve combo, like we saw at New River Gorge when it was redesignated. The preserve portion of the park would allow locals to retain access to hunting and fishing opportunities on surrounding public lands. So, what is it about those 80,000 acres that are driving this national park initiative? What is it about the Ocmulgee River corridor that proponents say is so special and so unique as to be deserving of a completely new national park? Well, to put it quite simply, the Ocmulgee River corridor is one of the most important historic and cultural areas in the country. This area represents 12,000 years of continuous human habitation. There are artifacts here that date from the earliest known human inhabitants of the southeastern United States. The mounds of Ocmulgee Mounds are the preserved remnants of one of the largest ceremonial centers for Mississippian culture in the United States, dating back all the way to 900 AD. They would have served as the bustling capital of a vibrant civilization, again centered along the Ocmulgee River. In addition, Ocmulgee Mounds was home to the largest archaeological excavation in American history. 800 men from the CCC excavated more than 2.5 million artifacts from this area in the 1930s, which is actually when it was first protected as a national monument. Military history abounds here as well, with connections to Queen Anne's War, the Yamasee War, the Civil War, and POW camps from World War I and World War II. Hernando de Soto's southeastern expedition would have come through here, and it's very possible that the Ocmulgee Mounds could have served as the location of the very first point of contact between southeastern Native Americans and Europeans. And there's more history associated with this area as well. The Ocmulgee River, at one point, would have represented the American frontier. From the end of the Revolutionary War until the Indian removals of the 1830s, the Ocmulgee River was basically the boundary of the United States. It was the frontier. And as such, it was fortified like the frontier. A series of 10 forts were built all along the river, known as Blackshear's Line, which served as staging areas for American troops fighting the British and Native Americans in this area. Overall, this is an era of American history, the southeastern frontier, which is largely underrepresented in the National Park Service. And last but certainly not least for our cultural and historical section, this area is considered to be the cradle of the Muskogee Creek Nation and is home to the only Native American traditional cultural property east of the Mississippi River. This is a sacred place for the Muskogee Creek, and current legislation actually would allow for co-management of the park between the Muskogee Creek Nation and the National Park Service, a rare arrangement that only 4 current NPS units have. That arrangement would bring the Muskogee Creek back to their homelands, to an area they were once forcibly removed from, and give them a seat at the table in the management of this park, to have a say in how it's run and how its story, and by extension their story, is told. Cultural and historical resources aside, though, there are also significant biological resources to protect along the Ocmulgee River corridor. Significant stands of bottomland forest, the same type of forest protected in Congaree National Park, are found along the river, along with endangered chalk prairies and significant wildlife dispersal corridors. The Ocmulgee River is home to an isolated population of Georgia black bear, along with 200 species of birds, 100 species of fish, 80 species of herpetofauna, and 50 species of mammals. And of course, these days, we can't talk about new national parks without talking about the economic benefits they provide. The National Parks Conservation Association commissioned a study, linked in the description, and it determined that an Ocmulgee National Park and Preserve would generate a 6-fold increase in visitation and add $206.7 million in economic activity over 15 years. It would support 3,171 jobs and generate $33.5 million in tax revenue for this area of Middle Georgia. 90% of that economic activity would be expected to come from visitor spending on tourism activities. So that's your overview for what stands to be protected by a national park here and the benefits it would provide to this region. That answers the why question when we talk about the significance of the Ocmulgee River corridor, why it's so special, and why so many people are pushing to create a national park here. However, you should know by now from watching this channel that it isn't so easy to create national parks. Even with the tremendous amount of historical, cultural, and biological resources on display along the Ocmulgee River, there are still significant challenges to creating a national park here. Luckily for us, the National Park Service has already done all the heavy lifting by putting together a brisk 300-page report outlining those challenges. It's called a Special Resource Study, and it's linked in the description if you want to do some light reading, but if for some reason you don't, I'll give you the gist of it here. Essentially, when the Park Service writes a Special Resource Study, they are evaluating said resource against the 4 established criteria for creating new national park units. Those criteria are 1. National significance, 2. Suitability, 3. Feasibility, and 4. The need for direct management by the National Park Service itself. A resource has to meet all 4 criteria in order to be considered for inclusion as a new unit of the national park system. In the case of Ocmulgee, the National Park Service says that the proposed park here in Middle Georgia meets only 2 of those criteria. The National Park Service is in complete agreement that the resources protected here are indeed nationally significant and entirely suitable for inclusion in the national park system. All of those things I mentioned to you earlier solidify the Ocmulgee River corridor as a cultural and historical resource juggernaut and a nationally significant habitat corridor unparalleled in the southeastern United States. So basically, the National Park Service agrees with all of the park's proponents and people who are pushing for an Ocmulgee National Park that this river corridor is worthy, if you want to use that terminology, of inclusion in the national park system. The hang-up, according to the National Park Service, is with that 3rd criterion, feasibility. The problem with creating an Ocmulgee National Park and Preserve then has less to do with the quality of the resources that would be protected and everything to do with the logistical and management challenges associated with getting this park up and running. Now, because this is the bottleneck for this entire project, I do want to spend some time here delving into the Park Service's analysis. They cite multiple community, budgetary, and managerial challenges that would be associated with a potential Ocmulgee National Park and Preserve. First, community. In their analysis, the Park Service interviewed multiple collaborators that would have to be involved in the national park effort. Several key ones were opposed to the creation of the park. This includes the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, who manages Bond Swamp National Wildlife Refuge, and the Georgia Department of Natural Resources, who manages those 3 wildlife management areas in the proposed park boundary. For both of these agencies, a new national park would require them to give up control and management over the lands that they currently oversee. Both agencies are opposed to this arrangement because they believe, in their eyes, that the resources under their control are best protected under the current status quo. Also in opposition are certain members of the public, including key landowners whose property would need to be acquired within the proposed park boundary. It is worth noting, however, that not all members of the public are opposed. Clearly, there is a lot of grassroots support for the creation of an Ocmulgee National Park and Preserve, including local leaders and several nonprofits. The Muskogee Creek Nation is also in support of the park under a co-management agreement. Both of Georgia's Democratic senators, John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock, are in support of the park, as well as Democratic Representative Sanford Bishop and Republican Representative Austin Scott, both of whose districts fall within the proposed park area. Now, even if it were possible to convince all of these stakeholders to support the park effort, there's still the question of budget. While it is true that the proposed park and preserve would incorporate several existing parcels of federal and state public land, the fact is there is still a significant amount of private land that would need to be acquired in order to properly protect the integrity of the resources in this area. According to the Park Service's analysis, these acquisition costs could run upwards of $226 million, possibly even reaching as high as $325 million. And that's assuming that all of those landowners would be willing to sell. If they don't, then you're essentially limited to a series of discontiguous park units, which wouldn't adequately protect the resources this park would be created for in the first place. In that case, the budgetary constraints would ultimately create management constraints as well. Park Service also cites $5 to $10 million in environmental cleanup costs and an operating budget of between $3 and $4 million annually for the park. All of this, according to the Park Service, essentially makes the creation of an Ocmulgee National Park and Preserve cost prohibitive. And finally, assuming you move past all of that, you get everybody on board, you move past the budgetary constraints, the Park Service cites one more logistical hurdle to the creation of an Ocmulgee National Park and Preserve, that of actually managing it. According to the Special Resource Study, the areas surrounding the proposed Ocmulgee National Park are severely threatened by resource extraction and development. Namely, quote, timbering and mining, expansion of agriculture, introduction of invasive species, acoustic impacts and development pressures from the adjacent Air Force Base, pollution and trash dumping, expanding development, and looting of archaeological sites, end quote. Basically, there's a bunch of activities surrounding the proposed park that would make it really hard to protect the resources inside of said park. And so, those three things, community opposition, budgetary issues, and development pressures, are core to the National Park Service's finding that an Ocmulgee National Park and Preserve is simply not feasible for inclusion in the national park system. It doesn't meet the feasibility criteria. There is that fourth criterion, need for direct NPS management, but the Park Service didn't even fully analyze that criterion because the feasibility wasn't met. Essentially, though, they say that Ocmulgee Mounds National Historical Park is already doing a pretty good job with the visitor access and interpretation of these historical and cultural resources, and that all of the land managers in the study area are doing a good job of protecting the resources already, thus precluding the need for the National Park Service to manage the entire area. In fact, they say that cooperative management among all existing agencies is likely to result in better resource protection than if the Park Service managed all of the land on its own anyway. That, my friends, is the rundown on the Special Resource Study. Basically, the Park Service agrees that the resources in this area are nationally significant and worthy of inclusion in the national park system, but that there are significant feasibility issues with getting this park off the ground and then later on managing it. There's some other stuff in there about possible alternative management scenarios, but I won't bore you with them. Again, the study is linked in the description. Now, despite all of that, if you were to ask me if I thought the Ocmulgee National Park and Preserve would still be created, I would say yes. Because none of the analysis I presented to you can account for perhaps the most important factor of all: politics. Parks have always been political, and the proposed Ocmulgee National Park and Preserve is no different. It would not be the first time that Congress has overridden the National Park Service's opinion on management issues. To that, I would say it's unfortunate that our leaders are willing to piggyback on all of the good things that national parks bring to their constituents and to the country, but are never willing to back that up with the funding and support they deserve. So, despite the Park Service's own conclusion that a national park here on the Ocmulgee River isn't feasible, I'd say it's still more likely than not that the Ocmulgee National Park and Preserve comes to fruition. The political and economic wins seem to be in its favor, and in all likelihood, it will be one of America's next national parks. So, when this issue inevitably comes up again, and it's all over the news and everyone is talking about it, I hope that by watching this video, you'll have a better understanding of what's being talked about, what's being proposed. You'll be able to have an informed opinion and engage in constructive conversations about the Ocmulgee National Park and Preserve. Like right now, down in the comments. Let me know what you think. Do you think that the Ocmulgee River corridor should be America's next national park? I want to hear your thoughts. As always, thanks for watching. Direct support on Patreon is always appreciated, and make sure to follow me on Instagram for pictures and channel updates. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.